River of Doubt, Chapter 5, A Change of Plans. It took 8 days for the Van Dyke, trailing a white ribbon of foam, to steam from Barbados to Bahia, Brazil, roughly a third of the way down South America's Atlantic seaboard. It would have been a much shorter trip but for the continent's enormous northeastern coastline, which juts into the ocean like a broad shoulder, forcing ships to travel hundreds of miles east before resuming their southward journey. 3 days before reaching Bahia, the steamer crossed the equator, an event that the crew and passengers celebrated with practical jokes and deck games in keeping with nautical tradition. But for Roosevelt and his men, crossing from the northern to the southern hemisphere was especially significant because it meant that they were passing the natural wonder that was to be the ultimate object of their journey, the Amazon River. From the deck of the Van Dyke, out of sight of shore, as they steamed along the Brazilian coast, Roosevelt and his men could not see the Amazon. But even at sea, there was no escaping the sheer size and power of the giant river, a non-stop deluge that by itself accounts for approximately 15% of all fresh water carried to sea by all of the planet's rivers put together. The river's mouth is so vast that the island that rests in the middle of it, Marajo, is nearly the size of Switzerland, and the muddy plume that spills into the Atlantic reaches some 100 miles out into the open sea. For Roosevelt, the prospect of exploring such a magnificent, unfamiliar phenomenon of nature was irresistible. The ex-president was no doubt also thrilled that the mighty Amazon was intimately related to another region he had explored and come to love so well, Africa. She then launches into a several pages long discourse speculating on the geological origins of the South America, how the continents moved, how the Amazon River was formed and the Andes Mountains, all of it involving millions of years, and a lot of speculation, doesn't have anything really to do with the story. So moving past that, for all its exotic allure and potential riches, the great Amazon River basin in 1913 remained a vast and remarkably mysterious place, untouched by modernity and repelling all but the most determined attempts to explore its hidden secrets. Although more than 2/3 of the Amazon basin rests within Brazilian borders, the vast majority of Brazilians in the early 20th century crowded along the sun-soaked eastern coast had little interest in knowing what lay within the basin and no way to find out, even if they had. Communication between the coastal cities and the country's largely unexplored interior was difficult, and travel was nearly impossible for the average person. The country's sheer size was one impediment. Its dense forests and rapids-choked rivers were another. The world's fifth largest nation, Brazil encompasses 3.3 million square miles, making it more than 250,000 square miles larger than the contiguous United States. The approximately 4,000-mile-long Amazon River slices through the northern section of the country and is navigable for almost 3/4 of its length, roughly the distance from Bangor, Maine to San Francisco, California. But its thousands of tributaries, which reach like tentacles into every corner of Brazil, are fast, twisting, and wild. Until very late in the 19th century, the only alternative for entering the interior was by mule, over rutted dirt roads and through heavy jungle and wide, barren highlands. The potential political consequences of such a vast, unknown territory in the heart of their country had been brought home to Brazilian leaders in 1865 when Paraguay invaded Brazil along its southern boundary, and more than a month passed before the Emperor, Pedro II, knew anything about it. Before he abdicated the throne 25 years later, Pedro II, who had reigned over Brazil since he was 5 years old, committed part of his military to the monumental task of linking Brazil's coast with its interior by telegraph line. Stringing the line through the jungle had since cost the Strategic Telegraph Commission the lives of countless men, but the battalion had explored thousands of miles of wilderness and was slowly mapping large swaths of the northern and southern highlands and the wide Amazon basin. Despite the progress the Telegraph Commission had made, however, vast stretches of Brazil remained unknown and unmapped, and its promise of adventure and discovery would soon prove too strong for Roosevelt to resist. The route that Father Zam had drawn up entailed travel along 5 of the best-known rivers of the continent: the Parana, the Paraguay, the Tapajos, the Negro, and the Orinoco, each of which appeared on even the most rudimentary maps of South America. Within days of his arrival in Brazil, however, Roosevelt would abandon Zam's tame itinerary and commit himself to an expedition that was much more interesting and exponentially more dangerous. On October 18, 1913, the Van Dyke landed in Bahia, Brazil, where Kermit Roosevelt was waiting for his parents on a flag-draped launch that the city's governor had sent into the harbor to welcome the former president of the United States to South America. It was a flawless day, and the passengers of the Van Dyke were all gathered on the deck for their first glimpse of Bahia, one of the country's oldest and most beautiful cities. Thousands of Brazilians waited on shore to greet Roosevelt, but he stayed in the city only long enough to take a tour, meet the governor, and pick up Kermit. He wanted to make sure that he was in Rio de Janeiro, then Brazil's capital, by October 21st, in time for a meeting he had arranged with Lauro Muller, Brazil's Minister of Foreign Affairs. A week earlier, aboard the Van Dyke, Roosevelt had written to the minister, gently reminding him that Ambassador Don Domicio da Gama had volunteered the Brazilian government's help in transporting the expedition's unwieldy boats and 5 tons of baggage overland from the Paraguay River to where they planned to begin their descent of the Tapajos. Da Gama had also offered to provide Roosevelt with a guide, but not just any guide. He had promised him Colonel Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon, the heroic commander of the Strategic Telegraph Commission. The 48-year-old Rondon had spent half his life exploring the Amazon and had traversed roughly 14,000 miles of wilderness that was not only unmapped but largely unknown to anyone but the indigenous peoples who lived there. On October 4th, the day that Roosevelt had set sail for South America, Rondon had just completed an inspection trip to Barra dos Bugres, the farthest point south on his telegraph line. Upon returning to one of his less remote outposts, he had found a telegram from Mueller, an old military academy classmate of his, waiting for him. Rondon had not been surprised to receive a cable from Rio. He had instructed the central office to send him regular telegrams with news of the outside world, messages that the telegraph operators had nicknamed the Rondon newspaper. But he was surprised by its contents. An order to travel with Theodore Roosevelt into the Amazon. Rondon had accepted the assignment, but, like Cherry, he had done so with reservations. He had made it clear to his superiors that he would join this expedition only if it was a serious scientific endeavor. He would not be a tour guide, nor would he join a hunting safari. The fact is, one of Rondon's soldiers later wrote, after Roosevelt made his expedition to Africa, the general assumption was that he was motivated exclusively by hunting concerns. Unknown to Rondon, the type of trip that he demanded was increasingly what Roosevelt had in mind. The ex-president had come to the Amazon for neither tourism nor sport, but for scientific exploration, and he held the deepest disdain for anyone who wanted anything less. The ordinary traveler who never goes off the beaten route, and who on this beaten route is carried by others without himself doing anything or risking anything, does not need to show much more initiative and intelligence than an express package, Roosevelt sneered. He does nothing. Others do all the work, show all the forethought, take all the risk, and are entitled to all the credit. He and his valise are carried in practically the same fashion, and for each the achievement stands about on the same plane. Mueller, a sophisticated cosmopolitan man who reminded Roosevelt of his own Secretary of State John Hay, quickly understood that what his distinguished guest really wanted was an expedition that had much more potential for scientific discovery and historical resonance than the journey that Father Zam had laid out for him. With a single question, startling for its simplicity in light of the series of events that it set in motion, Mueller made Roosevelt an offer. "Colonel Roosevelt," he asked, "why don't you go down an unknown river?" The river that Mueller had in mind was one of the great remaining mysteries of the Brazilian wilderness. Absent from even the most accurate and detailed maps of South America, it was all but unknown to the outside world. In fact, the river was so remote and mysterious that its very name was a warning to would-be explorers: Rio de Dúvida, the River of Doubt. Even Rondon, who had discovered and named the river, had been able to tell Mueller very little about its course or its character. Rondon had stumbled upon its source 5 years earlier while on a telegraph line expedition in the Brazilian highlands, the ancient plateau region south of the Amazon basin, and he and his men had followed it just long enough to realize that they would need a separate expedition, one solely devoted to mapping its entire length, to know anything of substance about it. When he was told that Roosevelt's objective was to unravel the unknown aspects of our wilds, Rondon himself had proposed the descent of the River of Doubt as one of 5 possible alternatives to Zong's more conventional route. No one who knew Roosevelt would have been surprised to learn that, of the 5 alternatives, he quickly chose the one that, in Rondon's words, offered the greatest unforeseen difficulties. Even in a time when great feats of discovery were almost commonplace, a descent of the River of Doubt would be audacious. Not only was the river unmapped, its length and direction unknown, and each whirlpool, rapid, and waterfall a sudden and potentially deadly surprise, but it coursed through a dense, tangled jungle that had a dark history of destroying the men who hoped to map it. One of the Amazon's earliest explorers, the first non-native to descend the Amazon River, Francisco de Orellana, suffered more than most. Orellana, who had lost one of his eyes during the conquest of the Incas in Peru, plunged into the Amazon rainforest in 1541 in the hopes of discovering the legendary kingdom of El Dorado, whose ruler was said to coat his body in gold dust and then wash it off in a sacred lake. Orellana's expedition, however, soon changed from a search for gold to a battle for survival. According to a friar who traveled with the expedition and chronicled its journey, before the men even reached the Amazon River, they were reduced to eating nothing but leather, belts and soles of shoes cooked with certain herbs. Once on the river, they fought nearly every Indian tribe they encountered, eventually losing roughly a dozen men to starvation and 3 others to poisonous arrows. Incredibly, Orellana survived to repeat the ordeal just 3 years later, this time losing 172 men to starvation and Indian attacks, before himself succumbing to disease and, some said, heartbreak at the disastrous collapse of his ambitions. 13 years later, another ill-fated Spanish expedition, this one led by 34-year-old Pedro de Ursua, set out to find El Dorado, which was rumored to lie at the headwaters of the Amazon River. Although Ursua had had many successes in his young life, on this expedition he made the fatal mistake of hiring Lope de Aguirre, a man whose name would later become practically synonymous in South America with deceit and brutality. As soon as the expedition reached the Amazon headwaters, Aguirre led a mutiny, murdering Ursua in his hammock and installing another man, Fernando de Guzman, as the expedition's commander. Guzman then met his own end one morning when Aguirre and a band of men awakened him at dawn and, after reassuring him, "Do not be alarmed, Your Excellency," shot him at point-blank range with their heavy matchlock guns known as arquebuses. Aguirre then took command of the expedition and tore through what is now Venezuela, ransacking towns, killing inhabitants, and burning homes. Spanish royalists finally caught up with him in Peru in late October 1561. In a bloody standoff, Aguirre was shot to death by 2 of his own men. He was then beheaded and his body quartered, gutted, and tossed into the road. The stories of death and disaster in the Amazon did not end with the withdrawal of the colonial powers from South America. As long as there was a wilderness in the heart of the continent, it seemed, men would be willing to risk their lives to find its riches, or at least discover what lay within. Less than 25 years before Roosevelt arrived in South America, a Brazilian engineer officer, Colonel Teles Pires, hoped to chart the course of an unmapped river that, like the River of Doubt, poured out of the Brazilian highlands, lost all of his provisions in a descent through Whitewater Rapids. The expedition was then beset with fever and starvation, and in the end, only 3 men survived. Pires was not one of them. The very idea of Theodore Roosevelt on a river that was as remote and unknown as the one that had killed Pires and his men was enough to make Foreign Minister Mueller quickly regret his impulsive suggestion that Roosevelt change his trip. "Now, we will be delighted to have you do it, but of course you must understand we cannot tell you anything of what will happen," Mueller hastened to warn Roosevelt, "and there may be some surprises, not necessarily pleasant." If Mueller was nervous about Roosevelt's decision to descend an unmapped river, Henry Fairfield Osborn was thunderstruck. The news, which Frank Chapman delivered to Osborn after receiving a letter from Roosevelt, set off alarm bells at the American Museum of Natural History. Horrified, Osborn immediately sent a blistering message to Roosevelt that he would never consent to his going to this region under the American Museum flag. This was not remotely the journey they had agreed on, and Osborn fumed that he would not even assume part of the responsibility for what might happen in case Roosevelt did not return alive. Roosevelt's admission that his new plan was slightly more hazardous than the original was, according to Frank Chapman, the understatement of the century. In a word, the bird curator later wrote, "It may be said with confidence that in all South America there is not a more difficult or dangerous journey than that down the River of Doubt." Roosevelt was more than willing to accept that danger for himself, but he would not force his men to do the same. Turning to his naturalists, his secretary, and his old friend Father Zahm, Roosevelt assured them that they were free to leave the expedition if they wished. "If they had the slightest hesitation, I would take them with me to the headwaters of the unknown river and then go down it myself with Colonel Rondon and my son Kermit, and I would send them back with the collections to the Paraguay and then home," he later wrote to Chapman. To Roosevelt's surprise, each of the men, even Zahm, who had drafted the original route, agreed to the drastic change of plans. The journey that Roosevelt had lightheartedly described as his last chance to be a boy had suddenly turned into his first chance to be something that he had always dreamed of being, an explorer. The little boy of 6 in the nursery on 20th Street had read with fervent interest of the adventures of the great explorer Livingstone, Roosevelt's sister Corinne would later write. He had achieved his ambition to follow those adventures as a mighty hunter in Africa. He had achieved many another ambition, but none was more intense with him than the desire to put the River of Doubt on the map of the world. Roosevelt lived during the last days of the golden age of exploration, a time when men and women of science roamed the world, uncovering its geographical secrets at a breathtaking pace and giving rise to bitter international competitions. The year he was born, the earnest young explorer John Hanning Speke, traveling with the famed Orientalist Richard Burton, discovered the source of the White Nile. In 1909, the year that Roosevelt left the White House, Americans Robert Peary and Matthew Henson won the race to reach the North Pole, the race that had nearly cost Fiala his life and the lives of all his men. Just 2 years later, in late December of 1911, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen became the first man to reach the South Pole. Robert Scott, a renowned explorer and British hero, made it to the pole a month later, only to find the Norwegian colors flapping in the polar wind where he had planned to plant the British flag. Shocked and dispirited, Scott and his men froze to death on their long, bitter journey back to their ship. Sir Ernest Shackleton and his men, in a legendary attempt to cross Antarctica, narrowly escaped the same fate 2 years later, the same year that Roosevelt would set off down the River of Doubt. To Osborn, Roosevelt's decision to descend this river seemed insane, if not suicidal, and he ordered Chapman to tell the former president that the American Museum of Natural History expected him to adhere to his original plan. However, when Chapman's letter, with all the weight of the museum behind it, reached Brazil, it had less effect than a leaf falling in the rainforest. Having found the challenge he had been yearning for, Roosevelt was beyond the reach of Osborne's persuasion. In a letter to Chapman, Roosevelt wrote, "Tell Osborne, I have already lived and enjoyed as much of my life as any 9 other men I know. I've had my full share, and if it is necessary for me to leave my bones in South America, I'm quite ready to do so." Osborne's objection to Roosevelt's new expedition was not only that it would take him through one of the most remote and least known regions of the Amazon rainforest, but that it was based on a sudden decision. The months of planning that had taken place in New York the past summer had been for a completely different kind of journey, one that could not be easily, much less quickly, adapted to fit the new route. Even Roosevelt had to admit that the man he had originally entrusted with planning his Amazon expedition was far out of his league when it came to the descent of the River of Doubt. "Father Zahm is a perfect trump," he wrote to Chapman on November 4th, "but he knows nothing of any of the country which we have planned to go through, and in practice can give us no help or advice as to methods of traveling and what we will or will not be actually able to accomplish." Zahm put on a brave face, writing to his brother Albert that he was most eager to begin the strictly scientific part of our trip, the exploration of an unknown river and an unknown region. But the abrupt change of plans must have been deeply disappointing. After little more than a week in South America, he was already beginning to lose control of his trip, a journey that he had conceived of, waited 5 years for, and lovingly planned. Zahm must have known that it would be unlikely that he would play a central role in the new expedition, if any role at all. It was becoming apparent to everyone in the expedition that they were not as well prepared for a journey of any kind into the Amazon as they had allowed themselves to believe. One of the most essential items for their trip, the motorboats that Father Zahm had ordered, not only were unsuitable for the new expedition, they would have been inappropriate even for the original route. Brazilians who had traveled in the Amazon took one look at the massive boats and bluntly told Roosevelt that it would be impossible to transport them through the jungle. Also, the provisions that Fiala had so carefully chosen and packed were more of a burden than a blessing in the eyes of the other men on the expedition. When Roosevelt's party reached Buenos Aires, the sheer volume of baggage that was unloaded from the Van Dyke drew a crowd of curious onlookers. There were mountains of crates, guns and ammunition, chairs and tables, tents and cots, equipment for collecting and preserving specimens, surveying the river, and cooking meals. After one of the baggage handlers, soaked in sweat, carried the final item from the steamer to the dock, a customs officer asked him if everything was now accounted for. Mopping his brow, the stevedore replied, "Nothing lacking but the piano," and the crowd erupted in laughter. Even worse, for Fiala, was Sig. Soon after they disembarked, the 2 men found themselves the lone custodians of this mountain of bags, boxes, and crates. Leo Miller and Cherry promptly excused themselves, explaining that they needed to start doing some collecting, and fled to Asuncion, Paraguay, leaving their companions to struggle with what Miller referred to as the expedition's appalling amount of luggage. Roosevelt, for his part, would have no opportunity to help get his expedition on track. From the moment he set foot in South America, he was plunged into a non-stop whirlwind of political commitments and controversies. His speaking tour through Brazil, Uruguay, a last-minute addition, and Argentina would follow a fishhook-shaped course down the Atlantic coast and then westward to Chile, before returning to Brazil and the Amazon. Frankly, Roosevelt was not looking forward to any of it. "I loathe state traveling and speech-making. Ugh," he wrote to his daughter Ethel in early December. He knew that his expedition through the Amazon would be difficult, but he suspected that it would be less unhealthy than a steady succession of dreary banquets and of buckets of sweet, tepid champagne. Zahm, on the other hand, delighted in the endless parade of banquets and dinners, and basked in the glow of Roosevelt's reflected fame. "As you will see from the papers sent you, I have covered much ground since I wrote you, and have been lionized everywhere, notwithstanding the fact that there has been a very big lion with me," he wrote his brother. "If I were young enough to be spoiled, I should now be beyond redemption." The excitement with which Roosevelt was met in nearly every city he visited, in countries whose governments and citizens supposedly feared and hated him, was testimony to the Rough Rider's legendary charm. Not everyone in South America admired Theodore Roosevelt, however, and he soon found that his detractors were as loud and passionate in their derision as his supporters were in their praise. Although Father Zahm would later refer to the tour as one continuous ovation, Chile was a notable exception. Students at the University of Santiago disagreed with Roosevelt on several serious issues, not the least of which was the Panama Canal. Roosevelt considered the Panama Canal to be one of the greatest achievements of his presidency, and he believed that the canal's architectural genius and the indelible mark that it, and through it, he would leave on the world more than justified the small South American revolution he had had to foment in order to make it a reality. In 1903, Roosevelt's third year in the White House, the United States government decided after much heated debate that Panama, rather than Nicaragua, would be the best location for a canal that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. At that time, Panama was a state within Colombia, and so Roosevelt had offered Colombia $12 million for the right to build the canal. When the Colombian Senate encountered with restrictive treaty language and a demand for more money, Roosevelt's response was impatience and contempt. He wrote to his Secretary of State, John Hay, that the United States should not allow the lot of jackrabbits in Colombia to bar one of the future highways of civilization, and he proceeded quietly to encourage and support a Panamanian revolution that had been bubbling under the surface for years. On November 3, 1903, with U.S. Navy ships lined up in nearby waters, Panama declared its independence. 15 days later, John Hay and Philippe Bonnevarilla, a Frenchman who had been the canal's chief engineer, signed the Hay-Bonnevarilla Treaty, which gave the United States control of the canal zone, a 5-mile-wide swath of land on either side of the waterway. A decade later, the Colombians were still fuming. When asked by a Brazilian official why he had left Colombia off of his South American itinerary, Roosevelt had replied, "Don't you know, my dear friend, that I am not a persona grata in Colombia?" Although Roosevelt had steered clear of Colombia, he would not be able to avoid a hostile encounter in Chile, where Colombian students had organized protests against him. When his train pulled into Chile's capital, Santiago, in late November, he was greeted by a crowd that at first seemed to mirror the friendly masses that had welcomed him to Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. But the moment he leapt from his Pullman to the train station floor, with the triumphal strains of the American and Chilean national anthems echoing around him, his welcoming party suddenly transformed into an angry protest rally. The human multitude, showing marked hostility, shouted with all their might, "Vivas to Mexico and Colombia, and down with the Yankee imperialism," a journalist for Lima's West Coast leader excitedly reported. The Chilean government went to great lengths to shield Roosevelt from the demonstrations, even buying and destroying newspapers that covered anti-Roosevelt rallies. But their guest had no desire to hide from any assault on himself or his country. On the contrary, he took every opportunity to face down his attackers, ready to explain in no uncertain terms why he was right and they were wrong. At a state reception welcoming him to Chile, he vigorously debated Marcial Martinez, a former Chilean ambassador to the United States, about the continued relevance of the Monroe Doctrine. Days later, in an electrifying speech, he gave an impassioned, utterly unapologetic defense of the Panama Canal. The speech was Roosevelt's last in Chile, and it left the country, if not convinced of Roosevelt's righteousness, at least impressed by his conviction. As soon as he began to advert to the subject, everyone was attention, and the silence that prevailed was almost painful, Zahm later recalled. The large auditorium in which he spoke seemed to be surcharged with electricity, and everyone seemed to be prepared for a shock or an explosion. Everything, the environment, the speaker, the subject, the great historical event under review, was dramatic in the extreme, and everyone felt that it was dramatic. Drama was Roosevelt's forte, and few subjects stirred him to greater emotion than did the Panama Canal. Whatever animosities may have been harbored against him when he began speaking, he had his audience in his pocket by the time he walked out the door. "I love peace, but it is because I love justice and not because I am afraid of war," Roosevelt told the spellbound crowd. "I took the action I did in Panama because to have acted otherwise would have been both weak and wicked. I would have taken that action no matter what power had stood in the way. What I did was in the interest of all the world, and was particularly in the interest of Chile and of certain other South American countries. I was in accordance with the highest and strictest dictates of justice. If it were a matter to do over again, I would act precisely and exactly as I in very fact did act." As these words rang through the hall, the audience leapt to its feet, cheering and applauding the Yankee imperialist. While Roosevelt was distracted from his pending expedition by 1,000 different commitments, his son and young cousin had only one thing on their minds: love. While in Buenos Aires, Margaret Roosevelt had received bunches of white roses every day from Henry Hunt, her admirer from the Van Dyke. Kermit, for his part, was still waiting miserably for a reply to the marriage proposal he had sent Belle a month earlier. He was a confident young man, but Belle had always seemed elusive, and Kermit was far from certain that she would agree to marry him. Not only was he thousands of miles away from her, but he had been so for more than a year. He also was not living in the kind of place that would necessarily appeal to a girl like Belle. While working on the railroad, Kermit had lived in a retired day coach that could barely accommodate him and his few belongings. Perhaps worst of all, in the rural areas where he worked, there was a nearly constant threat of disease. Kermit had had so many recurring bouts of malaria since he had moved to Brazil that the disease had become almost commonplace for him. It would not, however, seem commonplace to Belle, nor did it to Kermit's parents. When Roosevelt had first seen his son in Bahia, he had written to his sister, Bamie, that Kermit was not in quite as good health as I should like to see him. On the other hand, Roosevelt wrote, he has matured very much. He earns $2,500 a year, the equivalent of about $45,000 today, is deeply interested in his work, and it looks as if he has a future. Kermit hoped that that future would be solid enough to impress Belle, but he could not be sure. She was a beautiful, wealthy girl who was surrounded by America's and Europe's most eligible young bachelors. He knew that she could have any man she wanted. What he did not know was whether she wanted him. On November 14th, he finally got his answer. Dear Kermit, I'm very glad you did send the letter, because I do love you and will marry you. I don't know how or why you should love me, perhaps because I too have prayed, been unhappy, and now you love me and my heart is very full. What have I done that God should choose me out of all this world for you to love? But as he has done this, so perhaps he will make me a little worthy of your love. May he keep you safe for me. I love you, Kermit. I love you. Belle. When Kermit read Belle's reply, all of his worrying, all of the excruciating weeks of waiting were forgotten. He was obliged to attend a formal luncheon and an elaborate dinner that day, but he floated through both events in a joyous fog. I don't remember a word I said, though I remember all I thought, for I was with you the whole time, he wrote her. It just seems like a dream, dearest, and I get so afraid that I may wake. For if it's a dream, I want to stay asleep forever. Roosevelt was thrilled for his son. Kermit is as much in love as anyone could desire, he wrote his daughter-in-law Eleanor, and I am pleased beyond measure that he should be about to marry. Belle is a dear girl. Edith, however, seemed less enthusiastic about the match. She remembered Belle from the summer before Kermit left for Brazil, and now that her quiet, serious son was engaged to the young socialite, a girl Edith had nicknamed the Fair One with Golden Locks, she wrote Ethel that she felt a trifle down. Although his mother seemed to have reservations about his impending marriage, Kermit himself had none. He wanted nothing more than to board the next boat to Europe and at long last be reunited with his fiancée. While they were still in Bahia, however, Edith had pulled her son aside at the first opportunity and urged him to take a leave of absence from work so that he could look after his father in the Amazon. Kermit had no interest in joining the expedition, but he felt that he had little choice in the matter. He could see that his mother was worried, and he had to admit that he too was concerned about his father's health and safety. Roosevelt had always seemed invincible to his children, as though the great heart in his barrel chest would never stop beating. But the assassination attempt in 1912 had, with a shocking suddenness, changed all of that. Kermit, already living and working in Brazil at that time, had been hit perhaps hardest of all by the reality of his father's mortality. "It was a bad time to be far away," he admitted to Belle, "and the way in which I was told didn't help matters. I guess the man must have been worrying how to tell me and got mixed up. He's a big, up-from-the-soil sort of foreman and looked rather embarrassed and then said, 'Well, I guess that they've shot Roosevelt all right.' It was almost impossible to get anything more out of him. It was exactly like one of those breaking the news anecdotes, but it doesn't amuse you very much when it happens to you." Roosevelt had at first welcomed the addition of his son to his expedition, but the news of Kermit's engagement made him hesitate. He did not want Kermit to accompany him on an unavoidably dangerous journey when he had a fiancée who was anxiously awaiting his return. "I did not like Kermit to come on this trip with me," Roosevelt wrote his daughter-in-law Eleanor, "but he did not wish to be married in my absence, and moreover felt that his semi-exploration business was exactly in his line." However, in a letter to Belle, Kermit confessed that he was determined to go on this expedition not for his own sake, but for his father's, and he would count the days until the journey's end. "It just doesn't seem as if I could live so long without seeing you, but I feel so very sure that I am doing what you would want me to do," he wrote her. "Yesterday, Mother gave me another long talk about Father and about some other ways I must look after him. She's dreadfully worried about him, and there's nothing for me to do but go." Kermit's commitment to his father's expedition was painfully tested on November 26, when he watched his mother and cousin set sail for the Panama Canal from Valparaiso on Chile's Pacific coast. The thought of the months ahead of him without Belle made Kermit miserable, yet he stood resolutely by his father's side as the ship carrying Edith and Margaret disappeared in the distance. "We would have both felt that I must go with Father," he wrote to Belle that night. "If I weren't going, I should always feel that when my chance had come to help, I had proved wanting, and all my life I would feel it."